So what causes statelessness, and how can we protect stateless people worldwide? And can statelessness at some point be eradicated? Today, we will be speaking to Chris Nash, Director and co-founder of the European Network of Statelessness, to find out. We will also be joined by Christiana Bukalo, initiator and creator of the online platform Statefreeworld, Thomas McGee, an ENS member and coordinator of the MENA Statelessness Network Hawiyati, and also Catherine Harrington, manager of the Global Campaign for Equal Nationality Rights, Associate Director of Women's Refugee Commission. Could you, Chris, please tell us more as an expert on the issue and what the key issues are facing stateless people in Europe, and what is the network doing about that?
I guess that the first thing to acknowledge is the sheer scale of the problem. Statelessness is a legal anomaly that affects more than 500,000 stateless men, women and children in Europe today. And the true figure is likely to be even higher, given the difficulties in counting people who are legally invisible. And statelessness occurs both among families who've lived in the same place for generations, as well as among more recent refugees and migrants arriving in Europe. And I think the second thing to reinforce is the consequences of statelessness, the impact. Stateless people are subject to discrimination, marginalization, and abuse of their human rights. They are often denied many of the basic rights that you and I take for granted: to go to school, to see a doctor, to access employment, to register the birth of the child, as you said, sometimes even to open a bank account or obtain a driving license. And in terms of the causes of statelessness in Europe, they're similar to other parts of the world. So these include discrimination, state succession, conflicts of laws, as well as deliberate policies of nationality deprivation and deprival. And I guess why the problem still persists in Europe is that although all European states have clear international obligations towards stateless people, both to protect stateless people and to prevent statelessness occurring, these haven't translated into effective national frameworks. And this was, it was against this backdrop why we set up European Network on Statelessness back in 2012. We set it up as a coordinating body for organizations coming into contact with stateless people to act as a catalyst for change and to build capacity to act. And hopefully the need for ENS has been vindicated by the fact that since then, we've attracted more than 150 members in over 40 European countries. And as a network, given the need to create the space for reform and to make a case, for the reform which is needed, a key priority for our network, has been awareness raising. So with our members, we've published a significant body of research, we've grown our supporter base, and we've developed advocacy channels with key institutions such as the EU, the Council of Europe, and the OSCE. And there has been some progress made. I think over the last decade, 9 European states have acceded to either or both statelessness conventions. 10 European states have introduced changes to their national laws, which either better protect stateless people or prevent statelessness. And both the EU and the Council of Europe have made political declarations on statelessness, but much more needs to be done and much more quickly. And I think I would sort of prioritize or highlight 3 particular aspects where further action is needed. Firstly, Europe continues to be a producer of statelessness. So we did research back in 2015, which showed that more of half of European states had nationality laws that did not include full safeguards to prevent childhood statelessness. And although encouragingly Norway and Albania have improved their laws since then, there's still many European states who need to take action if we are not to continue to perpetuate statelessness, which of course is an intergenerational issue. And through our Stateless Kids campaign, we've been trying to coordinate advocacy and campaigning efforts to address that. The second issue is a failure of identification. Despite the fact that almost all EU member states have acceded to the 1954 Convention, only 6 EU states and 11 states across the Council of Europe currently have dedicated procedures to identify who on their territory is stateless and owed protection under the Convention. The analogy would be if states had no asylum procedures to determine who on their territory is stateless. And the result of this is that many stateless people are being left in an indefinite limbo, unable to regularize their status, unable to see family, and often subjected to immigration detention, destitution. And this can continue for many years unless governments step in and take action by establishing and utilizing stateless determination procedures to regularize and protect stateless people. And thirdly, we're becoming increasingly aware that much more needs to be done to address statelessness as part of Europe's refugee response. In your question, Fida, you highlighted the fact that Eurostat data for 2015 to 2017 showed that more than 100,000 asylum seekers arriving in Europe were recorded as either stateless or of unknown nationality. And that's not surprising when you consider that many countries from which asylum seekers come, such as Syria, Iraq, and Iran, both have large in situ stateless populations, but also have gender discrimination and nationality laws that prevent women from passing nationality onto their children on the basis of men. And this can create an added risk of statelessness for the children of refugees and migrants in Europe. We've done research on this through our Stateless Journeys project. And what we found is that often there's a failure to identify statelessness among asylum seeker arrivals who are often wrongly attributed with another nationality. And this can have several consequences, but to highlight just two. One is the fact that it means that where individuals are not ultimately recognized as refugees, at the end of the procedure, they can find themselves stuck in removal proceedings, often detained, but they have no country to which they can be returned. And another main cause is, as I just mentioned, the fact that if they have children who either are stateless because the parents are stateless or because the parents can't pass on nationality, if that is not identified, then the statelessness of those children will also not be identified, and states won't be able to recognize this and apply safeguards by granting nationality to these children. So these are just a few examples of what more urgently needs to happen in Europe and how our network's trying to support that.
So as part of combating statelessness in Europe, the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung has recently published the Atlas of Statelessness, which the European Network of Statelessness has contributed to as well. Could you tell us more about the Atlas and why it is important, and tell us more about the contribution of the European Network of Statelessness to the Atlas?
Well, firstly, to recognize the value of the Statelessness Atlas, which I think is critical in terms of, helping us to raise awareness about statelessness. The fact that it has a global coverage, the fact that the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation as a critical change maker and donor is taking an interest in this issue is really important in bringing attention to bear, because obviously if we don't understand the problem, we can't address it. I mean, I think it's fair to say that historically statelessness has been described as a forgotten issue, and is often considered as a niche issue. So, having high-profile publications like the Atlas, are really vital in helping to bring about change. And in terms of our contribution to the index, we've contributed 2 articles. One specifically looking at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on stateless people in Europe, and one looking more broadly, at statelessness issues and what needs to be done in Europe. And this latter article also includes information about ENS's statelessness index, which is another tool which is designed precisely to help raise awareness about statelessness. It's the first online comparative tool that allows an instant comparison of how different countries are performing with regard to how they protect stateless people and prevent statelessness. It's organized under 5 key thematic areas, and we currently have 24 countries included in the index. And working with our partners at country level, we assess how countries are performing against international norms and good practice, and then we have a scoring key to assess how different states are performing. And the idea of this is that the index can serve as an important monitoring and benchmarking tool. So it can be a tool for civil society advocates to identify what needs to change in a country to improve the protection of stateless people. It can be a resource for states who are interested to learn about good practices in other European countries. And hopefully it's also a tool that stateless people themselves can use to better understand their rights in a particular country. And I think what this tool does, and what the Atlas does, and some of the other initiatives that the other panelists will describe, what this all does, it sheds light on an issue which for too long was forgotten, and that's really important.
Thanks, Chris. Since everyone is talking today about the second wave of coronavirus, and we are seeing many reports warning that stateless people are at risk of being left behind in any coronavirus response. So I'm particularly interested in knowing how does the pandemic affect stateless people in Europe and also elsewhere?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to reinforce that stateless people are undoubtedly among the most marginalized by the pandemic. And unless their particular protection needs are recognized and addressed by policymakers, they will also continue to be some of the most impacted by the fallout from the pandemic. In terms of our network, I think the first thing to acknowledge is a lot more research needs to be done. And we're actually grateful for funding from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, which is enabling us to take forward some research on this at the moment, which we hope to launch early next year. But meanwhile, we've been in touch with our members in countries across Europe. We've surveyed them to understand what some of the impacts are. And there's, in a moment, maybe I could pick out sort of 3 key aspects that they've identified in their work with stateless people on the ground. But we know that there's been some really shocking manifestations of how COVID has exacerbated existing marginalization and discrimination against stateless people. We've heard shocking accounts from our member Roma-led organizations working in North Macedonia about how the impact has resulted in violent increases in hate speech, actual physical attacks on properties, and even more pronounced anti-Gypsyism. And this needs to stop, and it needs to urgently be addressed. In terms of sort of findings, which feedback we've had across our members, I think the first thing to say is that it's clear that the pandemic is having a clear economic, social, and health impact on stateless people. Secondly, it's exposed the lack of protection mechanisms for stateless people to access the rights they're entitled to under the 1954 Statelessness Convention. Stateless people, they don't have a nationality, they often don't have a regularized status, and they have nowhere else to go. So inevitably, they're more vulnerable during the pandemic. But thirdly, it's also shown that there are positive and inclusive responses possible by governments. So we are aware of some governments who've increased access to healthcare to migrants, including stateless migrants, during the pandemic. And I think perhaps that is recognition of a wider sentiment that with the pandemic, no one is safe unless everyone is safe. So it hopefully, as well as all the challenges it creates, it also presents an opportunity to bring to reality the universal right to access to healthcare and to make sure that happens.
Great, thanks, Chris. I'd like to dive more into that, but first I would like to ask Christiana about the new founded website, Statefreeworld. Great. So, what is the website about? Could you tell us more about that?
Thanks, Fida, and I'd love to tell you more about it. So Statefree.world is a soon-to-be launched digital platform and also online forum, which is solely focused on the topic of statelessness. And a mission is actually to, again, raise awareness and increase the transparency around the topic by providing a space to stateless people, but also their allies, meaning organizations and nonprofits and researchers, individual activists who are working on the topic. And with this space, we hope to empower and enable stateless people to actually speak up, to share their experiences, to share their stories, ask questions, support each others, and basically build a community to finally kind of experience a true sense of belonging within a group.
Oh, that's really great. So, I'm wondering what motivated you in the first place to set up the website?
Yeah, the motivation was actually a very personal one. So the idea was born a couple of months ago, or maybe it's probably already a year. Time runs very fast. And it came up at a time in which my level of frustration was extremely high with the topic. Because I myself, I was born in Germany, but I don't have a German nationality. So I have been affected by statelessness since I was born. And I've always had struggled with the topic. I never really had sufficient information. And also I couldn't really grasp the topic. And then at some point you just get very frustrated about that because I realized, okay, there's obviously, it seems to be there's no authority that feels responsible for my topics and for my needs. There's no one I can ask. I've never met another person that was affected by it. So you feel very much alone. And it also was kind of stressful to me to know that I'm very much impacted by a topic of which I don't even have solid knowledge and understanding of. So I again started to research, and I was a bit more persistent this time and looked into online forums and so forth. And at some point during that time, I found individual people who then referred me to different organizations. And that's also how I got in contact, luckily, with the ENS. And it was a very pleasant surprise that there are a couple of organizations that are actually fighting for my rights and are advocating for me. But it was also to some extent a bit shocking that I, as a person that is affected, didn't even know about it. So I felt like the information is very fragmented and very distributed around the space. There are a lot of initiatives, but I was missing the connecting link. And that's why I kind of decided to take it into my own hands and decided that it might make sense to actually provide a platform on which those initiatives and those people who are working in these initiatives and those people who are affected by it can actually talk to each other and collectively use the power and effort they have to solve the problem.
So, as someone who has experienced statelessness directly, what do you think, or what in your view should be done to address this issue?
Yeah, that's a very, very tough question, obviously, because there are a lot of different dimensions to it. And I think that's like the main slogan all the time, to end statelessness. And I, of course, understand the intention of it, but I also, my opinion is that I just like tangible goals also. And in terms of rather short term and midterm, and feel like there are maybe also other things we can already do while we are fighting to end statelessness. And on the one hand, Chris has already mentioned that awareness, it seems so simple, but we really need to raise awareness because I myself, I have never met any person that knew about the topic before I explained it to the person. I've never met anyone who is affected. Up until I started my research, I thought I was the only one, which is ridiculous now that I know the numbers. But there are people in this society who don't have any clue about the topic, and those people are contributing to the development of our society, right? Those people are building products. And for example, for me, it took me 4 times to verify my identity when signing up to Airbnb, simply because the technology wasn't able to identify me because there was just no knowledge about it. And so raising awareness is very important. Then also inclusion. So as long as statelessness exists and as long as people exist that are affected by the topic, it's important to include them into decisions which are made right now. So whenever there's a new law enforced and discussed, includes stateless people right away, instead of waiting until it's being pointed out by an organization, for example. And then learning from people that are stateless. As a stateless person, I'm not able to vote, so there's nobody representing me on a political level. So I think one of the things that needs to be done is definitely to have a conversation with those people who are experiencing the issue and the impact, in order also to move the effort that is being invested anyways into the right direction. So I think it makes sense to allow those people to speak up and share their experience, and to by that way make sure that what is being implemented actually serves their needs and also requests.
Great, that's really great. Um, More, I would like to hear from Thomas, since he is also a member of the ENS, and I would like to know more on how he became involved in the issue and the engagement with the ENS, but also about his work. As I understood, you have worked for many years on the issue of statelessness, Thomas.
Thank you, Fida. Sure. So actually, I first discovered, so to say, statelessness as an issue when I was living in Syria back in 2009, and then I was really shocked to learn that somewhere in the region of 300,000 ethnic Kurds in the country were living without nationality, and this was actually the result of a discriminatory measure taken against that community, Iraqi refugees in Syria, and there was a lot of international awareness of that. So I actually ended up doing my master's dissertation on the question of statelessness for Kurds in Syria. And over the years, my works really continue to focus on situations of statelessness in the Middle East, but also statelessness for people from that region who'd come to Europe. So that was how I became involved with ENS. So after becoming an ENS member, I was able to contribute to a number of projects and initiatives that the network was running. Particularly, I would mention the Statelessness Journeys project that Chris spoke about earlier. So that focused on the intersection between statelessness and forced migration within Europe. So for this project, I contributed to the research. I did interviews in Greece and the Netherlands and some other European countries. And we also produced a report that traced some of the experiences of stateless Syrians within the asylum context in Europe, and it highlighted the additional obstacles that stateless asylum seekers might face. So in claiming asylum itself, having a status recognized, and then various bureaucratic issues when it comes to trying to pursue their right to family reunification, exclusion from resettlement programs, and then most recently, I'm working with ENS on a photography project. So this aims to allow stateless people themselves to participate in how their own issue is represented.
And you are also the coordinator of the MENA Statelessness Network, Hawiyati. Could you tell us more about that, and why in particular you needed to establish a network specifically for stateless people from the MENA region?
Sure. So I'm one of the co-coordinators of the network. And again, having been involved with ENS, I'd seen just how helpful it is to have a regional network that can coordinate statelessness work across different countries and different actors. And the MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa, is really in need of this kind of collaboration. There's between civil society actors. Traditionally in that region, it's generally individual activists, lawyers and academics who are working on the issue. There have been a few key NGOs, such as Frontier Rawad in Lebanon, but not many. Recently, it's good that there are some diaspora organizations working on the issue, particularly in the Gulf. But it
you mean regarding the Bidun issue in Kuwait and
exactly, working on the Bidun issue in Kuwait, but then also other Gulf countries, they have similar issues where one section of the society is deprived of citizenship, and beyond this, there's a lot of other significant statelessness issues in the MENA. So it's one of the regions in the world that has almost half of the countries that have a gender discriminatory nationality law. So we have a shared concern with the global campaign. I'm sure Catherine will talk about that also. So that's a key issue in the region. And one of the other big obstacles is just simply the lack of civil society space, but then also the lack of recognition of statelessness as an issue. In the MENA region, very few states have signed up to the conventions, nor do they have a statelessness status in their domestic law. And we saw recently within the UNHCR I Belong campaign drive, only one state made a pledge to take action on statelessness from the MENA region. So we really hope that the network can be a way to provide solidarity across different communities that are affected by the issue.
And you also are working on a PhD at the Peter McMullan Center on Statelessness. What does the center do to address the statelessness? Could you just tell us a bit more about that?
Sure, I'll be happy to. Yeah, so my own PhD there is on the way that statelessness in Syria has changed since the start of the conflict in 2011. The Peter McMullan Centre on Statelessness itself is part of the Melbourne Law School in Australia. And it was established a few years ago, really with the objective to bring an academic focus to complement the important work of all of these various other actors working on statelessness. So the founder of the centre is Professor Michelle Foster, who has a refugee law background and has worked on statelessness from a legal perspective. But the centre is actually really interdisciplinary. So for example, I have a PhD colleague who's working on how using feminist theory to critique gender discrimination practices and laws in Nepal. In general, the centre's focused on the Asia Pacific region primarily. So it's had working on a project looking at the worrying situation of Assam in India, where 1.9 million people are at risk of statelessness. Also, I would just add that it's the centre's recently just actually in the process of launching a legal clinic, which is very exciting to work on supporting cases in Australia, really focused on the rights of stateless refugee children to citizenship. Alongside that, the centre runs an annual intensive course to raise awareness about statelessness among government officials and stakeholders. And it's also running an academic journal, Statelessness and Citizenship Review, along with ISI. So that's just a brief explanation.
Yeah, that's great. No, that's a very good explanation. And since you have already mentioned gender discrimination and nationality laws as one of the root causes of statelessness worldwide, I would like to hear more from Catherine about why or where this discrimination exists and why there is opposition to reform and what kind of challenges are facing us.
Thank you so much, Fida, and massive thanks to the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation for raising this issue and providing us with this platform. So today, globally, there are 25 countries that have nationality laws that deny women the same right as men to pass nationality to their own children. There are approximately 50 countries globally that have some form of gender discrimination in their nationality law. And the vast majority of those countries prevent women from passing nationality to a non-citizen spouse on an equal basis with men. I think it's always important to recognize that such discriminatory nationality laws were really historically the norm. So if you looked 100 years ago, that was the case in the United Kingdom, in France, and the United States, and in regions across the world. And that's unsurprising when you think about when many of these nationality laws were established. Women lacked the right to vote, to own property rights on an equal basis with men. The law itself was really designed in many ways to grant men their rights and not the same rights for women. So there's also a colonial route to where you see this discrimination persisting today. In not all of the countries that are concerned, but in a great number of them, many of these countries were former colonies, and at the time of independence, the norm at the time globally was still discriminatory. So many of these countries, when they gained independence, they based their nationality laws on the discriminatory norm at that point in time. Happily, most countries around the world, as you can see by the numbers, over 75% of countries globally have eliminated gender discrimination in their nationality laws. And there's a variety of reasons why these laws have yet to be reformed in the remaining countries. And quickly, just before I talk about the opposition to reform and what that looks like, I think it's really important to underscore, and I mean, Chris and others, actually all of the panelists have talked about the significant and wide-ranging human rights violations that result from statelessness. Gender discrimination and nationality laws, of course, results in significant human rights violations. And this is both for children that may be rendered stateless because of gender discriminatory nationality laws. They're, as other panelists have mentioned, they're one of the root causes of statelessness globally, but also for children and spouses and families that are affected by these discriminatory nationality laws that may not be stateless, but lack nationality in their country of residence. And for many of these children, in the only country that they've ever known, that they were born in. And so, that's lack of access to education, healthcare, property rights. I've had countless, mothers talk to me about just being so afraid if anything happens to them, their children can't even inherit their family home. So a real impact on individuals' lives, lack of access to formal employment, access to bank accounts, et cetera. So when we look at the opposition to reforming these laws in some countries, and of course, everywhere, there's people that have feelings on both sides, but those that are opposed to reform almost always frame their opposition in very much the same ways that people that are opposed to immigration or that debates around immigration get framed. So fear of loss of jobs to the other, xenophobia, perceived threats to national identity and unity, and the dilution of the national family. But of course, these concerns aren't raised when people are thinking about the right of men to pass nationality to their children had with foreign or non-citizen mothers, or men's right to confer nationality on a spouse. That is considered to be natural. That's the natural order of things by some that are opposed to reform. And so this really underscores that, and this seems obvious to say, that gender discrimination and nationality laws is really rooted in a patriarchal system that frames, the acceptability of discrimination against women in the name of these other concerns, whether they be perceived economic, security, national identity concerns. And as I think I will get to as we continue this conversation. The irony is that these fears are actually really unfounded, and in fact, you find that where you have gender equal nationality laws, it's not only in individual and family's best interest, but it really serves to benefit societies as a whole. And I'll look forward to hopefully talking a little bit more about that.
So what is needed to end gender discrimination in nationality laws, in your opinion?
So I think what is needed is a greater understanding by policymakers and the public that gender equal nationality laws are in fact in everyone's best interest. That they foster greater inclusion, they support sustainable development. You know, I think of an example from a family that I have worked with in Nepal, where the mother, a Nepali woman, she fell in love with a Dutch man who was in Nepal. He wanted to propose marriage, and she said, I would only marry him if he agreed to raise our family in Nepal. And now she said, over 30 plus years of marriage, he's more Nepali than I am. He speaks Nepali, he's immersed in the culture. And she really raised her children to want to give back to their country, to want to support the country in its development. And tragically, because her adult children don't have nationality in Nepal, it's a family that happened to be have a lot of opportunities in terms of education because of the resources that they personally had availed themselves to. Those children are now, those adult children now are, they have jobs internationally and they're quite successful, and they've had to build their life abroad and have been unable to really contribute in the way that they would want to because of the marginalization that they faced in Nepal. So I think what's really needed is for policymakers and the public in countries with this discrimination to really understand why these reforms are the right thing to do in order to uphold all citizens' equality, women and men's, and they're in countries' best interest. So what the Global Campaign for Equal Nationality Rights is working to do is to work with our coalition members that are based in these countries around the world to engage with policymakers, with civil society and the public to help to raise awareness about the harms caused by these laws and why reforms are really in countries' best interests. And again, you know, when we look at some of the biggest challenges that are facing the world today, many have solutions that are unknown. Some have solutions that are incredibly resource intensive. This gender discrimination and nationality laws, and really when you look at it, statelessness itself, is a relatively simple problem to fix with the political will. It simply requires amending laws to ensure that all citizens have the equal right to pass nationality on an equal basis to their children, and that everyone has a right to a nationality. So, I mean, those are really, it's simple, but it requires really a greater understanding of why gender equality and nationality laws is in everyone's best interest.
Yeah, and as everyone is still talking about the second wave of the pandemic, I'm also curious to know how does the pandemic affect your work?
Thanks. And I mean, this is a really, you know, gender discrimination and nationality laws is one tragic example of how discrimination against women hurts not only women and girls, but men and boys and society as a whole. And when you look at COVID, this is a really, you know, a sad example of how that plays out. So we, you know, like Chris and ENS, when the pandemic broke out, we were in conversation with our partners around the world that are working on the ground in these countries, and they were capturing the experiences and the hardships that were being faced by families during this time. And we saw two main themes taking place. The first one, of course, was experienced by stateless communities as well that are stateless for a variety of reasons. We had in a number of countries where the children and spouses of women who didn't have nationality in their country of residence, those families were denied the same access to COVID relief packages as other families that were all considered to be citizens. We know that in Jordan this was taking place, and in other countries. And you had families that because in many cases, the adult children who lacked nationality because they couldn't get it from their mother, you had families where the mother was the sole breadwinner for, let's say, a family of four with two adult children and her spouse who couldn't access formal employment because they were denied nationality because of gender discrimination in the law. So that family was already facing an incredibly precarious position financially pre-COVID, and then they were lacking the same access to COVID relief because the families of women citizens were not considered citizens because discrimination in the law. The other main thing that we found, again, in a number of countries, was family separation because of the combination of gender discrimination and nationality laws and the travel bans that were taking place. So you saw in countries like in Lebanon, in Malaysia, you had children, let's say young adult children that were studying abroad for a semester, who were abroad when the travel bans were starting to take place. Many of these children and spouses of women citizens who were abroad were denied entry back into their country of residence because, again, they're considered to be foreigners just simply because of gender discrimination in the nationality law. In Malaysia, you had the really unbelievable, tragic, dilemma that these families found themselves in. Women lack the same right as men to pass nationality to children born abroad. So many Malaysian women, if let's say they're on a temporary work assignment abroad and they're pregnant, if they are aware of the discrimination in the law, they will go back home to Malaysia. Some will elect to do this so that they can be sure to access nationality for their child at birth. Otherwise, they face an unknown and potentially years, if at all, trying to go through the bureaucracy of getting nationality for their children. So you had women that were in this terrible situation where, and some of them had family members that got ill back in Malaysia, where they had to decide whether they would go home to give birth to their child without their partner, who could not enter the country because he didn't have access to citizenship, or give birth abroad and face an unknown with their child having access to citizenship. So these are just some of the ways that, again, an unnecessary problem. The pandemic is a natural disaster. This discrimination in the law and the implications of it is a man-made disaster that doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine, for the very profound answer. Lots of work still need to be done to address the issue of statelessness, but we still hope that statelessness would be eradicated in the near future. And that takes me to Chris for my next question before we conclude. Do you think, Chris, that we can eliminate statelessness at some point? Is it possible?
I guess that's the $60 million question. And I guess if we understand that statelessness is a man-made problem, then with sufficient political will, it can be resolved. And I say a man-made problem, partly having listened to Catherine just now, and of course, many of the gender discriminatory laws were made by men and as part of patriarchal structures. But I think in saying that, we need to recognize that because discrimination is at the root of so much statelessness and denial of nationality, we should not underestimate that challenge. But in terms of reasons to be optimistic, the UN Refugee Agency has launched, is running its I Belong campaign, which seeks to eradicate statelessness by 2024, which is commendably ambitious. But it was encouraging at the halfway point of that campaign last October. UNHCR organized the high-level segment on statelessness in Geneva. It was very encouraging to see over 350 pledges made by states to address statelessness. And if we can translate those pledges into action and reform of laws, and that gives cause for optimism. If we can try and make sure that statelessness is firmly integrated as part of the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, in terms of trying to ensure that no one is left behind, then that can help us gain traction with our efforts. But it's going to take, more than 4 years to end statelessness. Other things that give me cause for optimism is, I think back to when I set up ENS back in 2012. It was me and 5 other people in a room, and the fact that our network has now grown, to have, over 150 members in 41 countries. In that time, we've seen sister statelessness networks emerge in the Americas, in Africa. Thomas was talking about the new network in the MENA region. We also have the fantastic energy and efforts which Catherine is doing through the Gender Campaign. The Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion have been galvanizing work at a global level, and very exciting is discussions underway at the moment to try and establish a global movement on statelessness. You know, all of these make me hopeful. I mean, I think it would be fair to say that as a group, we're very passionate and energized in terms of trying to address statelessness, but the challenge is that we're also quite under-resourced. So, you know, hopefully as more attention is given to the issue, we can attract more resourcing to support our efforts. We can engage, you know, actors working on child rights, refugee rights, anti-discrimination, and we can build the alliances necessary to bring about change. But I think, you know, if I was going to pick out the thing which is most important, but also gives me, you know, most cause for hope, is the fact that a key challenge to date for all of us working on this issue has been how we can better engage with people directly affected by statelessness, who have too often been missing from the debate. You know, but as I said, there's recently been efforts to try and turn this around. And as a network, we certainly strive to ensure that stateless people are at the center of all our work and both help to inform and to deliver our mission. Because it needs to be understood that stateless people are of different genders, ages, sexual orientations, socioeconomic backgrounds, abilities, religions, and ethnicities. And the causes and consequences of statelessness can only be effectively addressed if it is understood that stateless people are not just stateless, but have multiple identities and experiences. And a failure to hear these different voices in the past has meant that the links between statelessness and racism, patriarchy, anti-Gypsyism, and other forms of repression have been poorly understood, which has contributed to statelessness being seen as a niche issue and has inhibited efforts to address it. So if I was going to end with one final comment, it would be that we can end statelessness, but we cannot do it without the people directly affected by it.
True. Yeah, that's true. Well, that's all the time we have today. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Chris, Thomas, Catherine, and Christiana. And many thanks to everyone who joined us today. My name is Fida Zanin. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter under the Rosa Lux_Global, and feel free to leave us suggestions or of topics or guests for our future episodes on Twitter under Global Solidarity hashtag or on Facebook as well. Thanks a lot and see you next time.